Welcome to Life by Design, episode 295. Welcome to Life by Design. I'm your host, Dr. Jamie Richards, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Cratio Jug.
Always nice to be here.
Yeah, we are creators of Life by Design with 25 plus certified locations worldwide. Each week on the show, discuss the principles and the practice of Life by Design. Today's episode, we're talking about the autoimmune protocol, some type of modification that you can make to your Eat by Design diet if you fall within some specific categories. Cratio, hopefully my audio is a lot better this week. I know we've had a couple of complaints or at least gentle reminders of improving audio. And of course, you know, we always are interested in making this podcast better and better. So if you could see me right now, I'm going old school, I guess new school. I'm Tony Robbins. I've got the headset on. I'm rocking the mic. So feel free to shoot us some feedback. Let us know if this one sounds better and tighter and like we're back in the studio like we used to be in the day. But today we're talking about the autoimmune protocol. I think it really it bears stating and then repeating, who is this for? Not very many of you. That said, there's a few people that are going to get something out of this, and everybody else, at least you're going to understand what other people maybe have to go through if they're functioning or fighting through an autoimmune disorder, or if you're just testing yourself. You know, some of us like to just play around with our body and test things out. So let's talk about this, Cratio. I think it's a neat approach. There's different ways that you can access this. There's an article we'll put in the show notes from Mark's Daily Apple where he talks a bit about this, and you can go lifebydesign.com/podcast. Check it out there. The Whole 30 is a great program that really applies this autoimmune protocol. So why don't you start us off, Cratio? Tell us a bit about just autoimmune disease in general.
That's a great place to start. The truth of the matter is not much is known. I mean, the mechanism of why this happens. So an autoimmune disease is a condition where your body starts to attack itself, and it can take place in various different organs, right? If it takes place in the thyroid gland, it's called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. If it takes place in the kidneys, it's called lupus. If it takes place in the joints, it can be called rheumatoid arthritis or juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. And I think this is partly where part of the problem lies, because medicine by nature, and this is very good, is reductionistic, and they want to label everything, right? So they look at this as separate
Right.
thing, right? So they'll, like I just gave you all those labels. We want to look at things like the whole human body and why the body's doing what it's doing. Medicine, because the goal is to treat and to reduce the disease, has to look at everything the way that they are looking at things. That makes perfect sense. But what we're going to be talking about today, and why this is so important, is because it seems like altering your diet, when we're looking at all these cases over time, not that it necessarily cures or treats these illnesses, but the people who are sticking closer to these autoimmune protocols tend to do better. Some people to the point where they can completely, I wouldn't say reverse the damage done, but they can completely bring it to zero. So to me, that's super exciting, especially because I look at some of the people that we take care of in practice who have later stages multiple sclerosis or lupus or arthritis. It's bad. Like, it's really sad to see how devastating this is. So, I mean, any way we can possibly help, we're more than thrilled to do so.
And I'd like to state, as an extension of what you said, we're actually in the position where we would support traditional medical approaches in terms of how they're looking at this, because I think it's valuable to have a different perspective.
Totally.
Where this actually becomes, I think, a better approach is when you understand, both sides of the coin, not saying, well, this one's better than this one. They're looking at different things. So where you highlighted that the same or similar processes can affect different tissues, and then we label it based on those tissues, that really points to what the medical approach is. It's to, you said, reduce, identify, and label certain situations, and then try and address those oftentimes from a symptomatic perspective, targeted to whatever organ or functional system that we'll call it the quote unquote disease is affecting. The flip side of that is looking at this as a global process. And so if there's an autoimmune process, let's say, going on in the body, and it affects the thyroid, it's not to say that same process may not affect another tissue. It's why you could have an autoimmune disease and have multiple labels. So you could have MS, you could also have arthritis. So, again, there's a lot of the same types of things happening. So when you look at that, going back to the Life by Design model, we can look at it from our garden. So if our garden has all the plants and they're wilting, we could label that. We could say, well, this one's got green leafitis and this one's got brown leafitis, and whatever the name is going to be. But really at the core, you're going to start asking some fundamental questions. You're going to say, all right, does this plant have water? Does this plant have nutrients? What is the sunlight? Is there a rock pressed up against the stem of this plant? You're going to start with the basic fundamentals. So that's all of your eat, move, think, and power by design components applied to the human body. Now let's say you're doing all those and you're repeating them for an extended period of time and you're still dealing with, say, an autoimmune disorder. It's possible that you may have certain toxicities. So in this case, we're talking a lot about food toxicities that are essentially being caused by some foods that in people that it doesn't necessarily affect negatively are not a food toxin. So we'll hear a lot things like, I can't eat beef because it irritates my gut. And I think it's important to note that it doesn't mean that beef was the irritant. It means that it's possible the gut was already damaged from something else and now you can't eat beef, right? It's very similar to the carbohydrate conundrum that we talk about, where we're not suggesting that in a healthy body with solid physiology, somebody who trains, does a lot of things right, you can't consume a certain amount of carbohydrate. But we are saying if you have damaged metabolism, if you've gone so far in the other direction, carbohydrates might actually be toxic to you. And so the same thing here, and that leads us to this autoimmune protocol. Because when you hear certain foods, Cratio, on this list, you think, well, how is it possible that, eggs are a problem? I thought eggs were a real food. I thought they were by design. And this is how you start to go through this list.
Yeah, yes, you're right. I mean, that's important to know. It's not necessarily that the food on the list or not on the list. It's just like people with carbohydrates. Well, I'm low carbohydrate. And most of the time when I hear somebody say that I'm low carbohydrate, you're just lower compared to the average recommendation for carbohydrates. And basically what you're eating is a normal carbohydrate intake for your body.
Right.
So it's very similar in the principle, right? To say, and it's really restrictive when we go through this diet. And this is the same basis on the keto diet. It's not for everybody. It's for people who are trying to achieve something and to remove something based on a flawed metabolism.
Well, what I love about, say, the elimination diet here, or the autoimmune protocol, or something like the paleo diet or the ketogenic diet, they're all really just modifications of Eat by Design. And I know we're very proud of the fact that Eat by Design is a wonderful template and it fits perfectly with any of these. It's not a stringent, here's what you have to eat. It's saying what foods supply my body with nutrients with the lowest level of potential toxicity. And in someone who has an autoimmune disorder, or someone wants to tweak and test their body out, or someone who even has some symptoms that they can't figure out where those are coming from or why their body's producing those, the autoimmune protocol version of Eat by Design may be a great challenge for them to take on. And, going back to someone with a damaged metabolism, sugar is toxic. But in someone who has healthy metabolism, sugar is not necessarily a toxin, right? So when carbohydrates break down and they end up being sugar, if your metabolism is healthy and everything's working as such, the body's designed, you have glucose metabolism built into your body, in the cells of your body. It's only when that system has been overwhelmed for so long that a carbohydrate becomes a potential toxin or sugar becomes a potential toxin in that particular person. So the point is, if you're going through the elimination diet or the autoimmune protocol, I don't want you to think, well, I thought that, again, fruit was good for me and we're taking, say, dried fruits out, or you're telling me that coffee has antioxidants. Right, but what we're doing is we're building a list of foods that in some cases may have potential toxicity given somebody's particular situation, gut permeability, other types of, disease processes. Essentially anything that we're going to talk about here has the potential to be inflammatory in the body, potential to be irritating of the gut. So why not take it out?
So I think a good analogy, I was just thinking as you were speaking, like, overhead press is good for everybody unless you just dislocated your shoulder. Then you should probably stay away. Probably stay away from it from a little bit.
Or if you have years of anterior structural distortion and you can't put your hands above your head, then maybe the overhead press isn't the best for you. Great. So let me go through the list here, Cratio. And again, we'll make it simple and we'll give you a couple steps to get through. So let me talk a bit about some of these grains. Right. We've talked about grains over and over and over again. I think those are gut irritants that can be taken out in general as you move down the hierarchy principle from wheat and gluten-containing grains down to on the bottom end would be more of a white rice, something that's much less innocuous. Legumes, right? So legumes, beans, lentils, peanuts, even chocolate is a legume. Oh no! And again, let's initiate right here that the autoimmune diet is not easy to do, right? It's not something that's a simple 30-day challenge as much as, we would say promote for people through the 30-day challenge. This is a very stringent process because what you're doing is you are taking out as many food toxins as possible. You're trying to identify if there is something that is irritating to you, that is promoting this inflammatory process that's contributing to whatever disease process you've been labeled with. Processed foods, seed oils. So you're hearing a lot of the same things, Grisha, that we talk about. Dairy products, we've talked about dairy being a gray area, and that's why it's a gray area. If you're adapted to dairy, great, but in some cases you're not going to be. So the only way to know would be to remove that. Refined sugars, eggs. Eggs can be a bit of a problem. They are potentially allergenic in some people, and this is why we would take them out, especially the proteins in the whites, nuts and seeds, herbs from seeds as well, like coriander, cumin, and nutmeg, coffee. Oh no, not coffee.
I know.
Yeah, this is definitely a test project. If you have an autoimmune protocol, if you're really gung-ho on testing your body, I'm not quite that gung-ho about testing my body, and I don't have an autoimmune disease. So at this point, coffee is going to stand, chocolate, dried fruits. The big one, the one that surprises people a lot when we get into vegetables is the nightshade vegetables.
Yep.
Things like eggplant, potatoes, tomatoes, right? Pepper, okra. So these are things that you might be consuming on a regular basis, but they do have the potential to be gut irritating because of some of the anti-nutrients that are in the vegetables. Some of the spices made from the nutshade. So things like chili powder, paprika, cayenne, chipotle, and red pepper. And then some of your alternative sweeteners like stevia, xylitol, mannitol, alcohol. Of course, that's a potential gut irritant as well. So, a lot of the stuff on the list are things that we would already suggest that you take out, grains and legumes, seed oil, sugar, that type of stuff. But then when you start going through things that are a big part of your diet, that's where it starts to get a little bit rough. So I guess, Horatio, it leaves us with the question, what the heck can we eat?
Yes.
So,
pretty much green vegetables,
except for nightshades.
Right.
Right.
That's why I said,
so, right.
green.
Meat, veggies, poultry, fruits and vegetables, coconut, animal fats, the herbs that weren't on the list, bone broths, tea, and vinegar. Those are essentially, the diet over the course of 30 or 60 days. Why do we do this? Back to the purpose is these foods have been shown, in some case, some more and some less, to potentially cause an autoimmune response if someone has impaired intestinal permeability. We've talked about that before, leaky gut syndrome. Basically, things that are not supposed to be inside the bloodstream get into the bloodstream, and they create an autoimmune response. So this goes back to when we talked about, oh, well, I can't eat beef. And that oftentimes is the argument for some people. I know that beef isn't good for me because I can't eat beef. Well, it may not be the beef. It may be the fact that you consumed other foods. It could be grains. That's one of the culprits. And it created gut permeability and damage to the gut. And now when you consume beef, part of the beef and the proteins get into the bloodstream, and then the body tries to attack them. So I just want to make sure people understand the purpose of this, and we're not vilifying certain foods, especially foods that we've told you are really, really good. And, in 98% of the population, they're probably completely by design for them. But if you are experiencing disease processes that are autoimmune, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, multiple sclerosis, there's a lot of scolts in here, Cratio, for these. I don't know if that's a standard naming process for autoimmune disorders. But the point is, there's even some studies starting that are demonstrating positive outcomes for people on an autoimmune protocol. So that's exciting. Some of them, like you said, are not reversing the damage fully, but we are seeing people going into remission, which is pretty amazing. I'm just looking at a study here, small study, and they used an autoimmune protocol. And Mark Sisson talked about this in his article, but 11 out of 15 patients with either Crohn's or colitis, think about this, they'd been dealing with their disease process for an average of 19 years. When people say, oh, I've had this disease for so long, there's nothing I can do about it, 19 years. 11 out of 15 patients, Krish, total remission.
I get grumpy if I have a cold for 19 minutes, let alone 19 years.
Total remission.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Right? So it's not saying that they had an improvement, it's saying that they had total remission. So again, I think this is something that we really need to, think about. If you're dealing with these autoimmune disorders, if you're dealing with food sensitivities, or, if you just are interested in seeing what your body can do, then I think this is a protocol that would be worthy of testing out. Now, understand that, it's not going to be easy. It's definitely not for most people. It's definitely not going to be comfortable, but it would be interesting, at least in terms of an experiment. And if you're already to the point where you've been labeled, autoimmune, then I think it's a no-brainer. I think other than having surgeries and taking a bunch of medication and a life of struggling and frustration and pain, I think it just makes sense to give 30 to 60 days of the autoimmune protocol a shot.
Totally agree.
So guys, it's really a straightforward podcast today. We've given you the information. We'll put the article in the show notes so you can check it out. We'll also put in there our 30-day challenge so you can get more information from the team at Eat by Design. And hey, thank you so much for listening to Life by Design, and always joining the drive to 1 million families worldwide living life by design.